Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. We are day 80 in the war of Israel's war against Hamas and the other terrorists in the Gaza Strip. As the different fronts are developing, IDF is continuing on with its fighting in the Gaza Strip, developing not only the situations in the northern Gaza Strip, where there is almost complete control, but also now going further south into Rafah, into the other areas of the Gaza Strip that are still controlled by the Hamas terrorists. In the north, what we're seeing is the continuation of the war of attrition. Hamas is not the only Iranian proxy acting here, but also Hezbollah in the north, continuously firing rockets at Israel, firing anti-tank weapons at Israel and Israeli soldiers and Israeli civilians. That continued on today, with Israel responding, and so far there has been over 160 Hezbollah terrorists that have been killed by Israel in these conflicts. There has also been other bombings by the IDF, also in Syria and around, to prevent the flow of arms from Iran to Hezbollah. In the south, we're continuing to see the situation with the Houthis, another Iranian proxy acting out of Yemen, interrupting and disrupting the freedom of navigation and the access to Israel's southern border via Eilat and through Bab el-Mandeb, through the Straits of Tiran and the Red Sea. That's in Judea and Samaria. IDF forces are continuing on arresting and really fighting against the terrorists. Hamas in Gaza is no different from Hamas in Judea and Samaria. It's all the same organization, and so that fight is going on there. As we know, that that is an integral part also of the fight. Today, I'm joined today by the president of the JCPA, Dan Diker, Dr. Dan Diker, as we all know, and by Ambassador, Yoram. I didn't mean to slow you, Ambassador Ettinger. And Ambassador, I'm the only one here as a lawyer, and Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, who's going to be discussing today with us one of the different elements of this war, the impact of the Israel-Hamas war on the U.S.-Iranian relations. How has that changed? How has it been affected? And how is that going to be developing? And how do we expect that to be developing in the coming days, weeks, and months?
Yeah, Yoram, I just wanted to open up and ask you, as one of Israel's best analysts, not only of the Palestinian issue, but of the much larger macro issues in the Middle East. This is clearly a multi-front war. The Iranian regime is the head of the snake and has done a very good job in staying in the shadows, as it has done since 1979, mobilizing proxies around the region. And as Maurice said, the Red Sea region, the Bab el-Mandeb Pass, has become a real strategic choke point that is actually, it seems to be a casus belli already, according to Iranian regime behavior. Give us an overall sense, Yoram, how the United States is really cornered, in a sense, in terms of its policy to Iran and its policy towards allowing Israel to do what it needs to do in order to defeat this vicious and evil Hamas terrorist organization, as my colleague Maurice has so eloquently laid out.
Well, in many respects, the current war between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Hezbollah, has served as a wake-up call, certainly for Israel, following the big-time debacle of October 7th and the very impressive resurgence since that debacle, but also for the U.S. And in my opinion, primarily, it has been a wake-up call as for U.S. policy on Iran. The major question is, will the U.S. wake up as a result of that wake-up call? Because as of now, irrespective of the fact that it has been Iran as the major engine behind Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as the Houthis and numerous other Islamic terror organizations, all of them anti-American in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Latin America. Still, the U.S. adheres to its own diplomatic option on Iran, and as of this particular moment, it hasn't budged even an iota from that diplomatic option. And this diplomatic option goes back to 1978-79. If anyone would like to understand what is the nature of that diplomatic option, we should go back to the latter part of 78, the beginning of 1979, when the Ayatollah's regime toppled the Shah of Iran. The Ayatollah regime succeeded in toppling the Shah of Iran largely because of support by the United States. The State Department led then and is leading today the diplomatic option towards the Ayatollahs. And when one examines the cables between American embassy in Tehran and Washington, between American embassy in Paris, which communicated with Ayatollah Khomeini at that time in exile in Paris, when one examines the various documents of the White House and the State Department of that time, one finds out that the attitude by the U.S. at that time towards the possibility that the Ayatollah regime will take over control of Iran, referring to Ayatollah Khomeini as an Iranian edition of Gandhi, referring to Ayatollah Khomeini as anti-communist and therefore amenable to being pro-American. In fact, they refer to him as a stabilizing force in the Middle East, and certainly they assume will not be preoccupied with areas outside of Iran. The Islamic Revolution supposedly was to be limited to Iran, and at that time, President Carter even referred to Ayatollah Khomeini as a leader who is going to be preoccupied with tractors rather than with tanks. And all that attitude was based on speculative future scenarios, very subjective scenarios, taking very lightly or ignoring the reality of the Ayatollahs, exactly what we see today. To put it in metaphoric manner, borrowing from the Texas culture, which I've had the pleasure of being involved for many, many years. In Texas, they say you can put your boots in the oven, but that don't make them biscuits. Well, some State Department people believe that they can put their boots in the oven, boots about a moderate Ayatollah regime, and somehow it's going to be transformed into biscuits. The reality has been very, very different. And in fact, it is because of the diplomatic option that Iran has been transformed from the American policeman of the Gulf to the most poisonous, venomous octopus, anti-American octopus anywhere in the world, with poisonous arms from the Persian Gulf through the Middle East, East Africa, North Africa, Central and West Africa, all the way to Latin America, from South Chile to the U.S.-Mexico border and into the U.S. through litany of Iranian sleeper cells in the U.S. And we have seen that diplomatic option destabilizing the Middle East, threatening the existence of every single pro-American Arab regime, providing tailwind to anti-American terrorism, Islamic terrorism, being or fomenting civil wars in different parts of the Middle East and in Africa, and still, the U.S. State Department adheres to the diplomatic option, and we have seen that during the last 3 years, where economic sanctions were lifted off Iran, were suspended, especially the sanctions on the exportation of oil, and from 500,000 barrels a day that were exported by Iran under the severe sanctions, the export surged to anywhere between 2 and 3 million barrels a day. Simple arithmetics, it means extra $100 billion to the national income of the Ayatollah's regime, and that national income, as we know, has not been allocated or diverted primarily to enhance the standard of living, the level of welfare and education and transportation infrastructure, but mostly to the terror machine, to the drug trafficking, money laundering machine, proliferation of ballistic technologies throughout the globe, in an attempt to undermine the global posture of the U.S. and to undermine the homeland security of the U.S., but that has not convinced the State Department to move away from the diplomatic option, which has been a bonanza for the Ayatollah's anti-American rogue policy, and quite an economic setback to the United States. If we look at the direct threat to the U.S., we find out that since the early 1980s, the Ayatollahs focused on Latin America. And one may ask, why would the Ayatollahs focus on Latin America? And the response is very, very logical. They follow a 1,400-year-old religious fanatic vision, which talks about toppling all Sunni regimes as a first stage, and then continuing to bring the Western infidel to submission, especially the great American Satan. And they rightly so consider Latin America, South America, Central America as America's soft belly. Therefore, we have seen again since the early 1980s, shortly after they assumed control of Iran, we have seen very close collaboration between the Ayatollahs along with Hezbollah, which has been their proxies, and every single drug cartel in Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil. We have seen very intimate cooperation between the Ayatollah's regime and all Latin American terror organizations, and certainly very close ties between the Ayatollahs of Iran and every single anti-American, pro-Iranian, pro-Venezuela government in South and Central America. And as we know, very few governments in Latin America have remained pro-Americans. And that has taken the shape, for instance, of establishing terror training camps in Venezuela. They established in Venezuela sites for the development and testing of ballistic technologies. They have supplied the drug cartels with equipment to build underground tunnels, the same tunnels that they have assisted building or constructing in Gaza and between Gaza and Israel, between Lebanon and Israel. They've also provided Predator drones to Venezuela and the drug cartels. And mind you, the Iranians are among the world leaders in developing Predator drones. The bottom line is that the Ayatollahs are determined in the pursuit of their imperialistic vision. For many Westerners, this sounds delusional. Who do they think they are, taking on the USA, taking on Western culture? Well, they firmly believe in that, and it's a problem with the Western world, the Western societies, taking lightly ideology and assuming that just like many or maybe most Westerners, also the Middle East or the Ayatollahs in particular prefer a better standard of living, more financial and diplomatic benefits over old ancient ideologies. As far as the Ayatollahs are concerned, they adhere every single day to their ideology, which is based on the 680 Battle of Karbala. Who cares about Karbala in the Western world? Well, the Ayatollahs care about that. For them, that's the role model of battle for independence, the battle to fulfill their goals, the treachery by the Sunnis, the need to take vengeance of the Sunnis, and again, to bring every single non-Muslim religion and culture to submission. Many of us have seen on television mobs of Shiites, not only in Iran or Lebanon, but also in Los Angeles and Chicago and New York and Paris and London. Once a year, they march in the main roads or streets of major cities, usually, or many of them, bare-chested, flagellating themselves with iron bars, bleeding in commemoration of that battle of Karbala 680. They remember vividly 1500, when for the first time the Shiite religion became the #1 religion in Iran, and certainly they remember 1979 Islamic Revolution when they took over from the Shah. And when they look back at 79 compared to today, in 79, they were not a major element or an element to be reckoned with by the global community. Today, certainly, they are a major threat to be reckoned with by the global community, and there's no reason for them to be but optimistic about the trend leading them, what they believe, to the ultimate success, to bring the West and especially the Americans to submission. And as long as the State Department adheres to its diplomatic option, refusing to consider regime change, refusing to consider military option, there is absolutely no reason for the Ayatollahs to change their policy, to temper their pursuit of their goal. And once again, State Department apparently is possessed by speculative, futuristic scenarios rather than basing their future assessment on the track record of the Ayatollahs, the well-documented rogue track record of the Ayatollah, based on the ideology of the Ayatollah, which, by the way, is supported by the Ayatollah's constitution, by the Ayatollah's school curriculum, by the Ayatollah's Friday sermon in the mosques, by the Ayatollah's daily conduct, by the Ayatollah's daily media. And once you ignore track record and you move into the pastures of speculative, optimistic scenarios, you cannot be but completely detached from reality. And I would conclude by suggesting that basing one's policy on futuristic hope, or better yet, futuristic wishful thinking, ignores the advice one gets in the Southwest, especially in Texas, when they warn you, don't kiss chicken until they grow lips. I have not noticed that the Ayatollah's chicken have grown lips yet, but apparently some State Department top officials, the wise people at the State Department, have concluded that there is sufficient evidence to Ayatollahs with lips, and therefore they're moving on with their diplomatic option.
Yoram, it seems that you learned a lot during your illustrious term as the consul in Houston some years ago, and you remember the simple logic that Texas today, one of the only states probably in the United States besides Florida that offers such wisdom. Let me lay out a more nefarious scenario than the futuristic aspirational scenarios that you point to, very much in agreement that United States governments have not valued radical Islamic ideologies, whether the radical Shiite eschatology or whether a radical Sunni ideology, Salafist ideology, Wahhabi ideology. But here it seems that the U.S. administration seems to be pointing to Israel as a potential bad guy because of Israel's recognition that the Iranian regime is the octopus in the Middle East that controls the Hezbollah directly, that controls the Hamas, that controls the Houthis, that controls the Iraqi special groups, and as well as other groups in Syria, and that in fact it would be easier for the U.S. administration to pressure Israel, which is what it appears it's doing right now, in order to effectively possibly leave Hamas in power, even though Hamas would be wounded, in order that the United States would not have to take action against the Iranian regime, which seems to beg the question that you've laid out here for us in the last 10, 12, 15 minutes, because the evidence against the Iranian regime is so clear to anybody that is clear-eyed that it's hard to understand how, beginning with the Obama administration, the United States policy towards the Iranian regime seemed to shift 180 degrees. Would you agree that Israel is being set up possibly as the fall guy, as opposed to the Iranian regime, because it's a little more convenient for the U.S. administration to do that to its ally as opposed to an arch enemy?
Well, it seems to me that the worldview which leads to the current policy is not only addicted to speculative, futuristic scenarios, but also is addicted to multilateralism, to cosmopolitan type of national security policy, rather than unilateral, independent U.S. national security action. In that context, Israel is at odds with the State Department, because we have realized long time ago that the UN does not lead the world to more stability, but much more instability. The State Department takes the UN as a very, very positive element. the State Department, and especially the current Secretary of State, believes that terrorism is driven by despair, and therefore you don't deal with terrorism through military option, because military is not the proper response to despair. And that is applied to the Ayatollah's terrorism. It is also applied to Palestinian terrorism, as well as Hezbollah terrorism. And once again, Israel has been much more realistic, whether it's left of center Israel, right of center Israel. There is unanimity in Israel that the Ayatollah's terrorism is driven by fanatic religious ideology, not by despair. In fact, it is driven by hope, the hope to bring the West and especially the U.S. to submission. But that conflicts. It conflicts with the U.S. In my mind, the very highly appreciated U.S. support of Israel has been, in a way, dual-use support. On the one hand, yes, to support Israel by deterring Iran, by deterring Hezbollah, allowing Israel to focus on Hamas. But at the same time, the goal has been to prevent an Israeli preemptive action against Hezbollah, and an Israeli preemptive action against Iran, which, by the way, is called for because, as was suggested in the introductory remarks, we're talking about a snake-like action by Iran, engineering Hamas, engineering Hezbollah, supplying their military hardware, training them, providing them with finance. And here is the U.S. fighting, supposedly, or facing that snake by very feebly, or in a frailed manner, hitting the snake. And whenever the snake is hit, it's in the tail of the snake, never the head of the snake. And I believe that Israelis on the left and Israelis on the right realize that the proper way of dealing with the snake is by focusing on the head, and in that case, the head is in Tehran, but that conflicts with the multilateral, universal, and overall ideology of the State Department, and that puts or that positions Israel in an adversarial position. And everything which, by the way, is applied to Iran is also applied to the Palestinians, which only intensifies the dichotomy between the State Department worldview and the Israeli worldview.
Do you think, Ambassador Ettinger, that we're seeing somewhat of a change in this, possibly a change in some of the positions of the State Department? At the beginning of the term of the Biden administration, we saw really this rush to try and reintroduce a stronger and better and improved nuclear deal, an improvement, a change to the JCPOA. And as the talks developed, we saw really even the Biden administration coming to the realization that this wasn't a real deal that could be made, that the Iranians weren't willing to make the concessions that were necessary. They weren't meant to make really any of the concrete steps that the administration was looking for, on the one hand. On the other hand, even as we see very little possibly activity from the U.S. administration directly against Iran, what we did see at the beginning already of the conflict is the movement of two entire fleets of aircraft carriers, U.S. aircraft carriers, into the area, into the vicinity, somewhat of a deterrence against Iran. And now even we're seeing this international coalition really led by America, led by the U.S., really mobilizing against against the Houthis, against that activity in to prevent the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea through Bab el-Mandeb. Is that, do you think, a change or reflects a change in the opinion of the State Department, or is it something which is again just reflective of what they see to be a fleeting interest?
Well, I think a real change will require deserting the diplomatic option, because this is not a question of assessment anymore. This is a question of facing up to reality. 44 years since February 79, the Ayatollah's takeover of control of Iran has been sufficient time in determining whether the diplomatic option has had positive impact or negative impact on American interest, on the survival of the pro-American Arab countries, on the stability of the region, of the state of global terrorism. And all evidence has suggested that Iran's Ayatollahs are not partners for negotiation, but they are partners, but they are an element subject to removal from control of Iran. As of this day, the State Department still believes that a proper financial and diplomatic package could induce the Ayatollahs to accept peaceful coexistence with the Sunni Arab neighbors of Iran, that a proper such package, bonanza-like package, would convince the Ayatollahs for power sharing with the Saudis, with the Emiratis around them, and also to become good faith negotiators and even to abandon their ideology. All those assessments have to do with wishful thinking. Those assessments contradict very, very much the reality on the ground of the last 44 years. And it seems to me it's time for the State Department to admit that the well-meaning, the option of diplomacy, which has been driven by noble wishes, by noble values, there's no doubt about that, but it has conflicted with reality. It has been crashed on the rocks of Middle East reality. It's time to examine a substitute, because we don't see any sign that the Ayatollahs of Iran are willing to peacefully coexist with the Arab Sunni countries. We haven't seen any change as far as holding on to their ideology, but at the same time, it has been the lifting of American sanctions on Iran, which has made it possible for Hamas to attack Israel in such a horrific manner on October 7. Let's admit that side by side with highly, highly appreciated American support of Israel, it has been the lifting of sanctions over the exportation of Iranian oil, which made it possible for Hezbollah and Hamas to be equipped with creme de la creme ballistic missile technologies, electronics, tunnel constructions technologies, etc., which have caused quite havoc, and that's an understatement, here in Israel. And I have not seen a single sign that the U.S. is yet to give up on its diplomatic option. And in my mind, it has been an addiction to the diplomatic option, which has guided the U.S. in that manner. And I would say Again, it applies to the Palestinian issue as well as to the Iranian issue, because we haven't seen any impact of the current war between Israel and Palestinian terrorists on the State Department adherence, and I would even say fanatic adherence to the establishment of a Palestinian state. That
So
the
how,
US really want.
Ambassador Ettinger, how do you explain that? Really, from the first minute of the State Department's conception, they've been wrong. They supported, as you said, they supported the change, and immediately it started with the hostage crisis, all through the development of international terror and Iran's backing of international terror. They've been on the wrong side of the analysis into the JCPOA. They were wrong there as well, and they continue getting it wrong. What don't the State Department understand about the Iranians and about the Ayatollahs?
Well, again, as I mentioned before, it has to do with worldview. By the way, a worldview which puts the State Department, the Foreign Office in London, and the Israeli Foreign Office, sadly speaking, in the same camp, so to speak. It's a worldview which has not been revealed as erroneous during this particular war. The State Department did not want a Jewish state. The issue is not that they did not want a Jewish state. The issue is what was the rationale for opposing a Jewish state. They assumed that since the founding fathers of the Jewish state originated in East Europe, therefore a Jewish state was supposed to be pro-Soviet, anti-American. They assumed that the Jewish state would not be able to face up to an all-out Arab military offensive, which was expected, and it took place in 1948 or at the end of 1947. And they assumed that a Jewish state will deprive the U.S. of Persian Gulf Arab oil. All those assessments had nothing to do with reality. It had to do then, as it does today, again with speculative scenarios, because the State Department believes in the validity of futuristic scenarios rather than the frustrating, inconvenient, the very costly reality of today. The State Department misread the Ayatollahs, as I mentioned, back in 1978-79. The State Department misread completely Saddam Hussein, and until the very day of the invasion of Kuwait, August 1990, the State Department considers Saddam Hussein an ally of the U.S., and the rationale was the simplistic formula: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Since Saddam Hussein was enemy of the Ayatollahs, therefore he must be a friend of the U.S. And in fact, the State Department delivered to Saddam a green light for the invasion of Kuwait, when about 10 days before the invasion, April Gillespie, the ambassador to Kuwait and to Baghdad at that time, delivered to Saddam Hussein the position of the State Department, which stipulated, should Iraq invade Kuwait, this would be considered an inter-Arab, not an international issue. This would not entice the U.S. to get involved. The State Department considered Bashar Assad to be a potential moderate leader when he took over, because, again, according to the State Department, he was educated in Britain. He was an eye doctor, an eye specialist. He was the president of the Syrian Internet Society. He was married to a British educated Syrian wife. All that supposedly prepared him to be moderate and an asset towards to the U.S. And the State Department was the key element, the key entity to welcome the Arab tsunami of 2011, which is still raging on the Arab Street, as if it were Arab Spring. And I haven't detected any spring-like feature in the Arab tsunami. But the State Department saw it as a Facebook revolution, youth revolution, a march towards peace. And certainly the State Department was behind the U.S. NATO-led military offensive against Gaddafi in 2011 because of Gaddafi's mistreatment of Islamic terrorists in Libya. Therefore, they attacked Gaddafi, which caused the lynching of Gaddafi by Muslim terrorists in Libya, transforming Libya into a chaotic state until this very day, a platform of anti-American Islamic terrorism, anti-European Islamic terrorism, a site of series of civil wars with Russian and Saudi and Egyptian and UAE and Turkish and French involvement. And certainly the U.S. State Department opposed the relocation of the American embassy to Jerusalem for fear that this would cause an all-out Islamic anti-American assault, that this could be the end of Israel-Egypt peace treaties. The State Department opposed the recognition by the U.S. of the Golan Heights as being part of Israel, and many other revelations about the State Department being wrong. Why is it wrong? Again, in my mind, it has to do with a world view. When you believe that America's best interests are served by a multilateral, universal, cosmopolitan approach, sharing values, sharing national security concerns with the UN, with international organizations, with Europe, rather than an independent American national security action, then you've got a problem with reality, which is very costly, first and foremost, to American interests.
Ambassador Ettinger, unfortunately, you've given us quite a bleak outlook on State Department policy, really over the last 50, 60 years, that appears to have been missing the mark over and over and over again. I'm not sure it leaves us with a particularly optimistic outlook for the future relations. Just the hope maybe that in 2024, the State Department will actually realize that you cannot appease these homicidal, genocidal terrorists and also their leadership. They have a different worldview from us. They don't share our values, and as much as we would like to imbue upon them the beauty of our values, of that liberalism, of that cosmopolitan approach, it's unfortunately something which they really reject outright. And unfortunately, that's something which is difficult for many actors in this field to understand. We thank you. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end. We thank you very much for your very, very clear analysis of what's been going wrong with the way that really not only the State Department, but really the Western world responds to the threat posed by Iran, posed by the Ayatollahs. And I think it's something which we're going to have to develop further and further as we don't see necessarily any major change coming along.
Just one brief comment, Maurice, if I may.
Yes, of course.
I'm very optimistic. I'm not pessimistic, and I'm optimistic because the reality is that since 1948 until today, the State Department has been an adversary of the Jewish state. Since 1948 until today, every president, but one president, every other president, all of them have pressured Israel. But still, from 1948 until today, we have seen remarkable surge of U.S. Israel strategic cooperation. And the reason has to do with the very unique qualities of the Jewish state, commercial and military, but also with America's political structure, with all due respect to the State Department and the White House. In the US, there is also the legislature, which is a co-equal, co-determining branch of government, also on national security and foreign affairs issue. And while the State Department has been an adversary of the Jewish state, both chambers of Congress have been systematically on the side of enhanced cooperation with the Jewish state, and with the added element of a wake-up call. I firmly believe the future is going to be much, much better than the already good reality or positive reality of U.S.-Israel cooperation.
So really, on that positive note, we have to wrap up. Thank you very much again for joining us again, Ambassador Ettinger. We will be back with you again tomorrow at 4 o'clock Israel time. We look forward to you joining us, really to get this critical context and understanding of what's going on, not only directly in the war of Israel against the terrorists in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria, but also in this whole regional dimension of countries and world and geopolitics really playing itself out. Thank you very much. In the meantime, to those of you and those of our followers who celebrate, have a Merry Christmas, and we will see you again tomorrow.